This is For the Better, a podcast for those working to affect change within their team, organization, or community. I'm your host, Ben Cash. Thanks for tuning into the podcast, where we talk with leaders and change makers from purpose-driven organizations and discuss the great things they're doing. This podcast is produced by Reason One, a full-service digital agency helping those who do good do better. Today's guest is actually from this purpose-driven organization, Reason One. I'm excited to sit down with Nadia Rasool, who has been a front-end developer and accessibility practice lead at Reason One for a number of years. Thanks for joining me, Nadia.
Thank you for having me on.
Hey, welcome. I wanted to have you as a guest today because I've been a witness to your tireless advocacy for creating a more inclusive and accessible web, both internally at Reason One, but also externally out in the industry and the various things that you speak at and conferences and whatnot. And you're very passionate about it. And I can tell it's not just something you do for work. Where did this passion for accessibility come from? What's your backstory on that?
Well, it's something because I've always kind of thought about accessibility as an important aspect of my work when I became a front-end developer. And that happened because a number of years ago when I was in school, I was working at a radio station as well. And my producer at the time, he was visually impaired. And so we shared the same computer, and we would, when I would log on, a lot of times he would have his screen reader on, or when I worked with him, I would see him using the computer and all the different software through his screen reader. So it was just a natural part of how different people use technology. It never occurred to me that, this is something different. So obviously when I started building websites, it was something that was always at the back of my mind, that there are so many different types of people who are going to need to use these products. So it just kind of naturally came from that place. I also have a background in human rights and advocacy. And so if I'm going to transition to building websites, I want to keep that part with me and always think about how does anything that I build impact my end users.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm curious, how long ago was this, and what was the experience like for him at that point? Was the web less accessible than it is now?
This was, I don't know, over 20, it's been 20 years or 10, 15 years, ages ago. And what I experienced was that there were certain programs that obviously he could very easily navigate that had accessibility shortcuts built into them. Some things were definitely a lot harder. And over time, technology has evolved a lot. In the last even, 5 or 6 years, we've seen so many things change, so many more websites being a lot more accessible in the industry, a lot more people thinking about accessibility as an important thing, just as they naturally think of building a responsive website that's going to, get displayed on different devices.
Right.
Just as that sort of mindset change, a lot more people start thinking about accessibility as well. So definitely it has changed quite a bit. And it was a lot harder, I imagine, using assistive technologies with, for example, websites that were completely built in tables, I don't know,
right.
12, 15 years ago.
Well, I imagine there's probably still some websites out there that are, it's not a either or sort of proposition, right? That there's probably still a lot of websites out there that are not very accessible and probably present an experience similar to what he was dealing with back then. But those frustrations and the things with, dealing with an inaccessible web, what was that like? What did you sort of see in that experience when you were seeing that every day?
I think it's kind of challenging when people cannot accomplish the task that they need to easily. So for me, if I'm clicking a mouse and, going into a program to edit music or something, Using a mouse was definitely a lot easier, but I think some of the programs that we used, it made it easier to, like, they were more compatible with screen readers. So he was able to use shortcuts and work with those things. Obviously, I can't speak to his personal experiences
Right.
in a lot of detail, but it just, I think he was obviously a power user. So he was able to, like, you kind of figure out how you need to go about your task after you've had to rely on those technologies for a while. But I can, like, with my other friends as well, I can definitely see, like, with changes in technology with smartphones, they can, if the apps are set up properly, I can see them independently being able to order an Uber or a Lyft, or,
Right.
doing those basic tasks every day rather than relying on somebody to do it for them. And that just sort of gives them independence for starters. And it also just, like, it preserves their dignity. It also just doesn't get people frustrated that I need to buy this thing and I am able to add it to my cart, but then when I get to the checkout, I can't fill out this form to complete this purchase.
Right. Basic things that we take for granted, that all of us
For
probably
sure.
take for granted. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're getting a little bit into some of the technical aspects a little bit. Like, maybe we should define accessibility. What do you, for you, what does it mean to, what is web accessibility?
Well, for me, it means delivering solutions that are as inclusive of as many people as possible. So anything that we're building, we're making it easy for somebody who only relies on a keyboard or a screen reader, or even like a refreshable braille device or any sort of assistive technology, that they're able to get the information that they need, that they're able to perform the tasks that they're come to on the website without needing any sort of help. It really means having as inclusive websites as possible and making it usable for everybody.
Yeah, it's interesting you use the word usable and inclusivity. What are some of the misconceptions about, because that's a much broader way of thinking about it than just accessibility. What are some of the misconceptions about accessibility?
Some of the biggest misconceptions revolve around people thinking it is hard to do, it is, or that we don't have enough users who might benefit from it. And all of that is not true, because globally there is maybe 20% or more of the population who rely on some sort of assistive technologies. And that number is probably even bigger because it doesn't account for underreported disabilities, or if somebody has temporary or situational disabilities, like somebody might have a fractured wrist for a while and they might need
Right.
to only rely on their keyboard and things like that. So that means at any given time, your website is going to have some people who might face some sort of a challenge. And you can't just go about saying, well, it doesn't impact that many people because you just don't know. And
So
then
it's both temporary disabilities as well as disabilities that we wouldn't necessarily think of as a more serious disability that impairs
Mhm.
someone across a broader spectrum. Does that make sense?
Yes, so that also includes people with cognitive disability. So somebody who might, have a hard time focusing on tasks, or it might also be situational in the sense that if I'm outside and I've got a glare from the sunlight on my screen and I can't see something properly because the
Right.
contrast ratio on my elements on that page isn't good enough.
Right.
So it could even be situational things like that. But primarily, obviously, it's people, who might have issues like color blindness, or they might have reading disabilities. There's like a whole spectrum that we kind of don't think of, because when you mention disabilities, a lot of people might think of just somebody who's completely blind or somebody who has, who's in a wheelchair or doesn't have any mobility in their hands and feet at all. But it is a whole spectrum, and we have to think about all those different types of people.
It makes me think of closed captioning on TV because, before I started using that, I just always assumed, that's for, the closed captioning or sign language. It's for very specific people with very specific disabilities. But once I started to use it, or I found it turned on, I realized it's, the kids are noisy and I can't hear the TV, or the volume's low, or somebody mumbled something. And what's interesting about it is that it actually not just sort of like making sure I heard what they said, but there's greater content that it might tell me the song that was being sung. So it actually not just helped me understand the content that I was watching, but it was a better experience. So I actually have closed captioning on all the time now, even if the volume is fine, right? Because it's just a better experience. I mean, is that how you think of building accessible websites? It's not just about compliance, which is what most people think. It's like, what is it? What is the broader vision of accessibility?
It's definitely not just about compliance. It's not about ticking, check boxes saying we did this bare minimum. It's about thinking of how your user is going to actually use your website or watch that video, how they're going to experience your products. So if you're just thinking about compliance, you're going to miss out on a lot of these best practices that you can build in, which actually think about the user's experience of that product. In terms of like compliance, there might be, if you're bound to comply to the web accessibility guidelines, there might be like something that you build that could meet that bare minimum. So you could have that bare minimum level of color contrast, but maybe when you look at it, it's actually not enough. So just technically you pass, but maybe it really isn't a good experience.
Right.
So I really like to encourage all the people I work with to think about going beyond that legal requirement.
Right. Can you give me an example, like a common example that anyone listening would identify with, or something that a common task in a website or something where there's the difference between compliance and user experience, as you put it?
Focus outlines.
Okay.
That's like a
What's
super
that?
simple one. So, when sometimes if you're using a mouse, you might click on something and you see an glowing blue outline, or now in Chrome, it's kind of darker one. So Firefox uses a very faint sort of dotted outline. So technically it complies if you leave that outline on. A lot of times developers or designers might ask to have that turned off in code because they think it makes the site look ugly. But turning that off without giving sort of an alternative for it, it's really harmful for people who are completely relying on a keyboard as they're navigating through the page. So what we want to do is make sure that somebody who is tabbing through your page and they're going to different buttons and links, they need to be able to see where their focus is right now. So that is where your focus outline comes into play. And just doing the bare minimum, like the Firefox tiny dotted outline, it will pass the legal requirements for you, but it's not enough in some cases. It's sometimes like on certain colors that might still get lost. So unless you're really thinking about it holistically, thinking about all the different colors and backgrounds you're using on your page, and specifically designing something that looks nice on top of all of those and is visible, that's sort of like an example of how you can go beyond just the requirements and do something that's actually useful.
Yeah, that makes sense. So how does something like that get implemented? How does accessibility typically get implemented?
Accessibility gets implemented when you start thinking about it from the very start. You start thinking about it at the time of planning. You are writing your user stories and you're writing your requirements based on thinking about accessibility requirements within it. You are designing for accessibility. You are then building it out in code and making sure that everything, as you're working along, you're sort of testing your own work. Then obviously some people, like at Reason One, we have a really good QA department. They'll test for functional requirements, but then they will also test for accessibility. If people don't have a QA department, you can still test your own work using a screen reader, a keyboard, automated tools, all of those combined. And then you kind of launch your little big website into the world. But that's not where it stops.
Okay.
Because accessibility, it's really a process. So you've built an accessible site, you've launched it, but if you change your content, which most people do on their website,
right.
You need to make sure that any new thing that you're putting in there, it is also accessible. So your content, your images, everything is accessible. Otherwise, everything that you've built, all the good work that you've done, it's going to be pretty useless.
So I would imagine, if in an agency, you can, if everybody's focused on building an accessible solution, you can kind of work together for that outcome. Having worked with clients for 20 something years, I know that, not everybody is as committed to that ongoing. Like, how do you change that? How do you get the client? How do you get organizations and businesses to also care about accessibility?
I think one of the best ways that I've experienced myself is anytime I start talking about accessibility with our clients, most of the time people are on board, they care about it, they care about doing the right thing. Sometimes it's a little bit challenging because of, different constraints they might have, not because they don't care about people. It's more like, budgets and this and that.
Right.
So what really works for me is showing people examples of how people with disabilities might use the web, showing them somebody using their website or part of their website with a screen reader. Or if you're not able to show them that, you can talk about how it might impact the end user. And as soon as they think about some of the challenges people might have, you can literally see it click in their head. They're like, oh, I didn't think about it this way. This is important. We need to do this. So sharing that kind of information rather than just saying, well, we have to do it because it's, you're legally required to do it, or this is something you should do. I think more than that, if you help them understand how people use their website or what challenges they might have, that really helps them understand.
Yeah. Sort of like your own aha moment that you had, I guess. Yeah.
Sure.
So you mentioned legal risks. I know that's something I often hear with clients, and what motivates a lot of businesses to get compliant, as it were. How have you seen that play out in different countries, and just the legal requirements and those things? Because I know sometimes, like you said, budgets, a variety of things, people just have to check a box. They have to just solve the problem. How have you seen legal things come into play?
So I've been pretty lucky that for a majority of our clients that I've worked with, they are based in Canada, especially in Ontario, and legally they are required to meet AODA, which is the Act for Ontarians with Disabilities. And then, so I don't have a lot of, struggle in convincing those people.
Sure, right.
But sometimes you do come across situations where, if your client is based in the US, where the legal requirements are a little bit murky because you're supposed to comply under ADA or
508 and
508, yes. But it's not as explicit in the way it is laid out. So over there, you see a lot of different big companies getting sued all the time because people, are having issues on their website. They're not able to buy concert tickets or, order a pizza or whatever. So if people like, Beyonce has been sued, Domino's.
I remember the Beyonce. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and she went and like she didn't personally go and build an accessible website, but, so there are cases where when issues are brought to these companies, they will do the right thing in working with people with disabilities and making that sure that their websites are accessible in the future. Sometimes people do pushbacks. Like Domino's case, they were ordered to make an accessible website. They were fine. They were like, no. So they're kind of like, challenging that and stuff. But laying sort of those kinds of things out in front of your clients that you work with, that kind of opens up sort of, I guess, their eyes a little bit more to it as well, that there is a risk here that if we don't do this, we as a company are going to look bad and look like people who don't care. And nobody wants to be seen in that light, obviously. But then also it's like a legal risk as well in that sense.
What was interesting, it's funny you mentioned that Domino's example, because I remember seeing that, and it was quite the Twitter storm against Domino's at the time. And I might have this wrong, but if I recall, it was the cost to fix the issues was about $38,000, something to that effect. And they decided no, and they wanted to fight it in court. So, clearly they spent more than $38,000 with lawyers to fight this thing when they could have just done something that was actually more inclusive and the right thing to do. Have you seen brands and organizations become more aware of accessibility and be more open to those things?
I have. You see a lot more companies talking about it openly, either on their social medias, on their websites. So the way people are, I think in the last few years, there has been a growing trend of consumers wanting to align themselves with brands that are good, that do good things in the world. So even if a person themselves does not maybe need assistive technologies to use a website, they care enough about the brand that they're going to give money to that, they want to support other people who might need those accommodations. So.
Well, it sounds like it's, good for the end user, which is a broader definition than I think most people realize. It's good for avoiding risk, whether it's AODA or whether it's legal challenges in the US, and it's good for business or good for your brand. It sounds like, yeah,
definitely. So yeah. It's not just like that you're going to be able to serve your users with disabilities. It's also all your users are going to see you doing good work and caring about accessibility. Whether you're, posting it on your social media, you've got an accessibility statement on your website, or some sort of, any other accommodations that you've done on your website that might be quite visible. People are going to notice that, and they're going to be more interested in aligning themselves with your brand.
That's good. Well, you mentioned one thing that I wanted to follow up on, or we were talking about in an agency, right? You're talking about all your colleagues, you're working together to create a more accessible websites. How does that work? Having been in this industry for a long time, I've known some agencies that really care about it and invest in that, and then some agencies that don't. So how does that change happen in an organization? How does it become part of the organization?
So the change, well, there are two ways of change happening. Either it comes top down and, the leadership decides that this is something we have to do. So everybody starts to think about it, or it kind of comes bottom up. And I think for us, it really did come bottom up, where a few people who were really passionate about accessibility got together, started like a working group to learn about accessibility for themselves and to implement it in their work. And that group got really big. Like, at one point, I guess we had like half the studio part of it. And that really, like the passion that they had, it kind of was, it almost infected other people as well. And the more good work they did with accessibility and the client saw that and we pushed for it, we started getting a lot of, support from the leadership as well. And it grew into us having all these extended services that were accessibility specific that we didn't have before.
Right.
And to the point where right now we do, like in the last few years, we've set our accessibility standards for the agency. We follow them for every project that we have. We try to grow our knowledge throughout the studio. We train our different departments. But it kind of came out from like just a handful of people being very passionate about it. And, right now we're in a pandemic, so we're not all going into the office. But when this group used to get together, so our offices, they have like these glass walls, and you could see a bunch of people sitting there talking about stuff really excitedly for an hour, really engaged in something, having these deep discussions. And anybody who saw them walking by, they'd be like, I want to be part of that group. It looks like they're having fun, but they're also learning. They're doing interesting things. I want to know what it's about. So it kind of just grew from that, I think.
Yeah. And that's Riot, right?
Yes, it is Riot. Reason One Accessibility Team, or Riot for short.
Yeah. Nice. So you're a front-end developer. Obviously, there are, a lot of aspects to accessibility that relate to the development, the coding, right? How you build something. But given the participation and what you're talking about with Riot and the different team members, where does accessibility live in the larger multidisciplinary approach?
So I think one thing that I really love about the philosophy behind Riot is that accessibility is not just the developer's role. It is part of everybody's role. So we have project managers, we have product owners, QA folks, we have content strategy people, designers, developers. Everybody is part of that group. And we encourage as many people across the studio as possible, because it's really not just one person's responsibility. You can't have a successful, accessible project if you say only the developer is going to, or the front end developer is going to care about it. We don't have to worry about it. They can just fill it in when it gets to them. And that's not how it works. You have to have your, starting from your very first conversations with your clients. So even your account managers and everybody need to have this at the top of their head. And everybody who touches a project in any different role, they might have different responsibilities. They're not going to be the ones, writing the accessible HTML, but they will need to think about how we're planning and designing the solution all the way to the end. Sometimes it can be a challenge. Sometimes, I've had struggles with trying to get everybody to think about accessibility beyond just the development group. Because when you think about, or when you do a lot of research around making accessible websites on Google, you will come across a lot of resources that are geared very much towards developers. And that kind of gives the impression that it's something you will only address in that phase of your project. And that's like another big misconception, really, because accessibility, it's everybody's responsibility. So having all our different departments think about it, and there have been different struggles in trying to get people to think about it, to implement it in their work. But I think once we set our company-wide standards, that really helped solidify it for a lot of people, because it was seen as a thing that we do as a company. It wasn't just something that a group of people from Riot, a bunch of front-end developers, or some designers were trying to push.
Okay. Where do you spend a lot more time thinking about this than most. where do you see accessibility going, or where's the industry going? I think we're at WCAG or WCAG 2.2.
So 2.2 we're at 2.1 right now. 2.2 will get released sometime this year, probably in summer. And then there is 3.0 coming down the line in a few years.
So what does the future of accessibility look like? What should we be thinking about?
I think, so the way WCAG right now is set up, you are only looking at pass-fail sort of situations. So if one thing on your website doesn't really conform, your website is classified as like it's a failure for the entire site. What's going to change in the future is how you think about different parts of your site. So that's like sort of still in development. It's going to be quite a few years before, we even get like the first proper draft for it. But I think the way it's going to change is how you think about different components, different flows on your website, rather than a holistic thing. So once you start to sort of put things in these little chunks, it feels like, as people building the site, and maybe somebody who's new to this industry, it feels a lot less overwhelming to build accessible experiences. Because you're only, thinking about little bits and pieces at a time. But I think that's sort of the mentality that even we should have right now when we're thinking about different functionality that we are building. Because a lot more people are also using mobile phones as their primary way of navigating the web. So I think the last time I checked, the stats said about 50% of the people, or the 50% of the global web traffic, is through mobile. Wow. So yeah, it's amazing like how fast things have changed already.
Yeah.
So
what does that look like? I mean, if it's, you were talking about sort of screen readers and keyboards and various things before. I know mobile disrupted so many other things about the internet and continues to, but how does mobile disrupt accessibility? How does that change the game?
So pretty much any smartphone will have a screen reader on it. So for iOS, we have VoiceOver, that if your apps and your websites are set up to be accessible, they are easily navigable using VoiceOver. And it's the same for Android as well. And I think the way it shifts is when the way people switch their thinking around starting to build responsive websites to the extent where right now, that's the only way we build them. Nobody's building static sort of layouts that only look good in certain devices. I think it's the same way where you're going to start thinking about accessibility as just, it is the thing that you build into your website. It's not an added on feature. Right. And building a responsive website where, your content is scaling down properly, that is also something that helps accessibility in some ways. So having clear content on smaller screens, efficiently laid out user flows where people can quickly get to the things that they need because they don't have a lot of real estate, like you would on a laptop or a desktop. Having to think about those sort of things also helps you think about building things in a more accessible way. So if you have a clear heading structure, that is something that helps with accessibility. If you have clear content, you have less distracting things on the page, all of those kinds of things help. Or like when you have...
No, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add that, when your site scales down for a responsive design, you also help people who might be using Zoom technologies, and they're, able to easily, like the content layout isn't going to break when you zoom in.
Right. Yeah. I mean, everything you described, it sounds like just good usability, right? That happens to also be accessible and compliant and all those things, right? Well, thank you so much for sharing your passion with me. I want to ask you a couple questions before we wrap up here. So, what is we've talked about a lot of different types of organizations, right? Agencies, businesses, and organizations themselves, in users. There's a lot of different organizations and people involved in this. What is one thing that each of those organizations could do to help create a more inclusive, accessible web?
I think some of the easiest things you can do is think about how easy it is for your user to complete the main task that they're there to accomplish, whether it's to buy something, whether it is to make a donation, or just get some information. How easy are you making? Have as fewer steps as possible to accomplish those tasks. Keep your content as easy to read through and easy to navigate through as possible. Think about color contrast and making sure that people can easily read all of the stuff that you have on your website. Simple things like that. Having alt text.
Yeah. And are there any tips you would have for those with disabilities at varying degrees to increase their ability to navigate websites? Any tips or tricks? Or
I think people with disabilities probably are much more, accustomed to using the web than I could give input on. Like for them, from their perspective, they are the power users of all the different assistive technologies. The only thing I would ask is more of a request. I guess it's almost a favor for people who are building the web is if you come across challenges on a website, reach out to somebody and tell them that this is a problem and make them listen. And hopefully that business or that nonprofit or whoever it is, that organization will do the right thing in addressing those challenges for you.
That's a good point. Thank you. And besides you, of course, who is someone that people should follow or listen to learn more about accessibility?
There are so many amazing experts out there that I follow, and I absolutely would recommend all of them. But I think some of the names that come to the top of my mind are there's Marcy Sutton, who's a developer, Hayden Pickering, Leonie Watson, Sarah Horton, and Sarah has this one book, Web for Everyone, that is a great resource for everybody to read. It's not just developers or designers, it's anybody who is a professional in this industry, they should read that book. Also just looking through the A11Y hashtag on Twitter gives you so many amazing people and resources. It's really a blessing.
Right. That's an important note there. People who are in the accessibility field often use the A11Y as a shorthand for accessibility, right? It's if I got this right, the 11 letters between A and the Y. That's what it stands for?
Yes,
okay,
exactly.
Right. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today. Your story is so compelling, and looking forward to seeing more things that you do, and seeing you lead the way. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
This has been an episode of For the Better. For more information, episodes, or to be a guest on the podcast, visit forthebetterpodcast.com. Thanks all. Be well.